Howdy, readers. I'm Jason. This is Chapter and Verse, and tonight I am going to be talking about Ulverton by Adam Thorpe, which I did recently as a buddy read with Mark Nash. I will link Mark's video below in the description box. Now, Mark and I chatted about this book with each other as we read it over Voxer, which has kind of become the go-to app for buddy reads. And those discussions were incredibly rewarding, in many ways, at least as good as the experience of reading the book itself for me, sometimes better. There was one chapter in particular that was hard going, we'll say. It begins in 1650, and over the course of a dozen chapters or so, takes us up through the late 20th century. Some of the chapters appear as journal entries. A couple of the chapters appear in a kind of epistolary form as letters. In one case, from a mother to her condemned son. In another case, from a wealthy woman, an aristocratic woman, to her lover, who may or may not have jilted her. The last chapter in the book takes the form of a kind of transcription of a documentary, and it appears in screenplay form, which is interesting. Now, the book isn't without its problems, and there are a couple of problems as I see it in particular, one of which is the chapter Stitches, which is pretty much indecipherable. It's one of those things where you just have to just keep reading the ink on the page, and just have faith that it's not going to make any sense, so don't try to make any sense of it, or much sense at all. And I just thought I'd show you, just hold up to the camera here, one of those pages, so you could get some idea of what Mark and I were contending with in that one chapter. I know it's funny, as I was reading that chapter, I could picture somebody writing their master's thesis or dissertation on this book, and going through that chapter line by line, looking to kind of decode it. And it's like Finnegan's Wake in miniature or something. And life's basically too short to make sense of things that are actively resisting sense being made of them. The other kind of key flaw I felt in the novel was that last chapter, the screenplay chapter, which is too bad for me, because as someone who has written screenplays and who used to teach screenwriting and who just has an ongoing, long-going love affair with cinema, I was really looking forward to that chapter. And I just felt like it was a real missed opportunity by Thorpe, frankly. The fact that the screenplay takes the form of a documentary, and not a terribly engaging documentary at that, made me wonder how that last screenplay chapter might have kind of tied the book all together if Thorpe had chosen instead to write a short screenplay of a feature film, a fictional film, a film that took kind of great risks and comedic risks. One of the things that happens in the last chapter, as is in the documentary screenplay chapter, is the unearthing of the skeleton of one of the characters from the first chapter in the book, in the 1650 chapter. And he had been a soldier in kind of Oliver Cromwell's campaigns, military campaigns, and in it, I don't know, I mean, it was vaguely interesting as presented, right, the discovery of his body, but only insofar as it was the past intruding on the present. But with, all the talk of development and golf courses and such in the final chapter of the book, what is to become of Ulverton, as sort of wealthy vacationers kind of move in, I just kept thinking how wonderfully it could have tied the book together if he had presented that last chapter as a fictional screenplay, in which, for instance, maybe we saw retired British dudes playing golf on one of these golf courses that's been discussed. And then we also see some of the soldiers from Oliver Cromwell's army just kind of walking across, right? Don't mind us, play through. I think that could have been a much richer, more inventive, more satisfying kind of close to the novel. And now I want to talk about some of the things I really loved about the novel, because the good that is in this book is really good to my mind. Mark and I had very different opinions on the book, which is wonderful, actually. Reading the book together with him, and he touched on this in his video, it revealed a lot to each of us about how the other reads and what the other kind of prizes in fiction, what the other is looking for, is expecting, really wants fiction to be. And that was fun. In many ways, that was the best thing about this buddy read. But what does the book do really well? So I love how the novel explores how, over the course of generations, ordinary stories within a community, within a kind of circumscribed area, can become legends, can become folktales. I thought that was so fascinating, especially as someone from the West, right? Where, I mean, I live in Wyoming, where we had, in the Wild Wild West, we had all of these real figures, right, who ate breakfast every morning and, had to change their boots once in a while, and who went to the bathroom each day if they were lucky. And they became so much larger than life, right? People like Buffalo Bill Cody, for instance, and even smaller figures, people who were villains on some level. If I remember right, the last public execution in Cheyenne, Wyoming, where I grew up, was of a man named Tom Horn, who was hanged, I think, on the corner of, I want to say Cary, and I can't remember what street. I could have those streets wrong. But every time, as I was growing up, every time I drove by that corner, I would always think of that. And somehow it was like the ghost of Tom Horn was sort of haunting downtown Cheyenne. And so I loved how the novel paid attention to that. And also how the book really explored how individuals, through their property, through their family name, through their offspring, really look for and long for legacy, right? And I think it was something common during that time, right? The 16th and 17th centuries. I mean, we know that Shakespeare, for instance, applied for a coat of arms as a way of somehow kind of lending majesty or authority to his family name. It was important for people once upon a time, this idea of legacy. And so I thought the novel did a really good job of kind of digging into that as a theme. An example of how we see kind of ordinary stories being kind of, transmuted into legends or folktales. There's a character in the first chapter of the book. She owns a farm. She is kind of strange, I suppose, right? People sort of whisper about her maybe in the village. But then later in the book, 113 years on, we learn that the affair that she begins carrying on with the shepherd at the end of that chapter has become something different in the public imagination more than a century later. And here's a paragraph, right, that relates to that. So remember, this is set in 1743. What I'm reading to you comes from a letter in 1743, 113 years after the woman on the farm had the affair with the shepherd. My fancy runs faster than my reason. I have night terrors. I asked the maid to entertain me. She told me of the legend here, of a shepherd who made love with a witch, and she bore a boy lamb that he reared as his own son, till it went among the flock by mishap. And the shepherd, he being old and deaf, don't hear its cries, and slew his own son, like Isaac might have done. And the old shepherd haunts the crest still as apparition, calling out, where, where, where? I fancy I hear him at night, though in the morning I think it the owls. Which is just lovely and mysterious and slightly creepy. And there's a bit of that in this book. So I also just really love the central idea of Ulverton, this idea of following a place through centuries of gossip and upheaval and movements from kind of pastoral inventory and enterprise to kind of cultural preservation. I found that really, really fascinating. And in fact, the book that it reminded me the most of, and in some ways couldn't be more different from, is James Galvin's The Meadow, which I've talked about on this channel before. And this is a novel about a little patch of land, a little town in, I want to say it's northeast Colorado, actually. Just below where Laramie, Wyoming sits on the map. And this is a real place. It's a novel. But this meadow that is central to this book it's a real place, and the figures in this book were real people, and this is Galvin's kind of memory of it. So it's kind of part memoir, part novel, autofiction, maybe Steve would call it. But this was published well before autofiction was a thing, I think, and it somehow doesn't have that feel, that kind of look at me. It's just it's lovely and it's lyrical and. And this book, like Ulverton, understands that there have been people in the past who have been kind of forgotten by history or overlooked by history. And Galvin looks to give those people, these country folk, you might say, looks to give them a voice, which Adam Thorpe does more often than not, I think, really well. Occasionally it doesn't work well at all, but more often than not, the ways in which Adam Thorpe looks to give these kind of peripheral figures from English history a voice is pretty beautiful, I think, and pretty evocative. So I thought I would just end with a couple of my favorite passages from the book to give you guys an idea of the language at its best in this novel. And this is from page 9. I could see them through the parlor door, which was latched back. Gabby's arm, its red cloth and buttons, his hand round a cup. Anne's face, with the hair like Mary Mother of God's in the church before the soldiers came to burn her. Thomas Walters opposite, looking hard at the table, still with his hat on. Thomas Walters was the Spitz of his father, also Thomas, a shepherd from the next valley, who I would meet at the fairs and did not like for his drinking. They sat in silence. I wished to see Gabby's face and tried to tell his thoughts from the hand tight round the cup. Thomas Walters was sullen. He had a clean jaw. His hat was 20 years old. He was 34. Anne had the sad look of Mary in that old painting. Well, no one had killed anyone, I thought, and there were Gabby's old ribbons on the table, like they had always been there, though no one had spread them out. And then the last bit that I wanted to share with you comes from page 41. I ask thee, is not that man that runs toward death willingly more culpable than those poor Gadarene swine? For he does it in full knowledge of his trespass. We are weighed in the balance, and are found wanting, and if the grapes be not fine, the winepress cannot be trodden into sweetness. The Lord it is who decides when the tender grape shall be gathered, when the reaper shall bow with his hook, and the ears of the barley fall. To cut ourselves untimely off is to wither on the vine, to foul the streams of Lebanon, to worm the apple and bring frost to the garden of our souls, and the chafe of despair upon our necks, O my children. That, in my view, is really lovely writing, and I'm glad to have finally gotten to this book. It's been on my shelves for a long time, since long before Kelly and I were married, and I've wanted to read it kind of desperately all that time. And so I thank you, Mark, for doing this as a buddy read with me. However difficult it was at times. I hope you guys are all doing well. I will see you again this weekend, possibly with a tag video. I'm quite behind on tag videos. I think I've got 5 that I've been tagged to do that I haven't gotten around to. So maybe we'll see one of those this weekend. But in the meantime, adios.